What if I told you that in a world built on chains, one man walked freely at night, not because he escaped, not because he rebelled, but because the very people who owned everything allowed him to pass? Imagine this: the sun goes down, doors are locked, patrols move through the darkness. Every enslaved person is expected to stay hidden, silent, afraid, and yet one figure steps into the night. No chains on his wrists, no guards stopping him, no questions asked. He enters houses that others could never approach. He crosses property lines without fear. He moves through spaces meant to be forbidden, and plantation owners let him. This is not a legend. This is not fiction. This is a real story buried deep inside history. In this video you will meet a man whose role breaks everything you think you know about slavery. A man who existed in the shadows of power, trusted yet owned, protected yet never free. You'll learn how slavery was not just enforced by violence, but by systems of permission, by silence, by carefully chosen exceptions. This story matters because it exposes something uncomfortable. Slavery was not always simple control. Sometimes it was strategic. Sometimes it depended on people who moved between worlds. This man heard things others never heard, saw things others never saw, and knew secrets that could not be written down. Why was he allowed such access? What did plantation owners gain from his movement? And what did it cost him? Historians rarely talk about figures like this. Records avoid names. Documents stay vague. But patterns remain. And patterns tell stories that words refuse to say. By the end of this video you will understand how power really worked after dark, how fear and trust existed side by side, and how one man's nightly freedom reveals the hidden mechanics of an entire system. This is not just about one person, it's about how control adapts, how rules bend when power needs them to, and how history hides its most uncomfortable truths in plain sight. Stay with this story, because once you see how the night operated, you'll never look at the plantation world the same way again. Before we talk about the man who walked freely through the night, we have to understand the world he lived in. Movement was not just restricted, it was engineered. Every step an enslaved person took was measured, watched, and controlled. The plantation system was designed to make stillness the norm and motion a threat. Nighttime especially was treated as a dangerous window. Darkness gave cover, and cover meant possibility. That possibility terrified those in power. Before we talk about the rules, it's important to understand why movement mattered so much. If people could move, they could meet. If they could meet, they could plan. If they could plan, the entire system could collapse. So freedom of movement was treated like a weapon. It was taken away deliberately, not randomly. Control of bodies meant control of futures. Before we talk about nighttime, we need to look at the daylight rules that made it possible. Enslaved people were expected to stay within assigned areas, fields, quarters, work zones. Leaving without permission was considered defiance. Even stepping onto a neighboring plantation could trigger suspicion. Boundaries were invisible, but punishment was not. Before we talk about passes, understand this: permission had to be written. A small piece of paper could decide safety or suffering. Passes listed names, destinations, and time limits. If you were found without one, explanations didn't matter. Intent didn't matter. Fear did. Patrols didn't ask questions. They enforced order. Before we talk about the night, imagine the sound of doors closing. After sunset, enslaved quarters were expected to go silent. Movement after dark was assumed to be criminal. Lamps went out, paths emptied. Anyone seen walking risked beatings, imprisonment, or worse. The night belonged to patrols, not people. Before we talk about punishment, understand that it was meant to be remembered. Whippings were public. Confinement was humiliating. Separation from family was devastating. The goal wasn't just pain, it was example. One person's suffering was meant to freeze everyone else in place. Before we talk about freedom, we must be honest about how rare it was. Movement was not a right, it was a privilege granted temporarily, and only when it served the system. Even skilled workers, drivers, or messengers moved under strict watch. Trust was thin. Fear was constant. Before we talk about exceptions, recognize the rule. Slavery depended on stillness, on knowing where people were at all times, on making the act of walking itself feel dangerous. In that world, anyone who moved freely stood out. Anyone allowed to walk at night was not just unusual, they were a contradiction waiting to be explained. Before we talk about who he was, we need to understand why he mattered. In a system built on fear, trust was rare and expensive. Plantation owners did not give access lightly. Every permission had a purpose. Every exception served a function. This man was not special because he was favored. He was special because he was useful. Before we talk about his role, we must look at the problem plantation owners faced. Large estates ran like machines. They needed messages delivered quickly, emergencies handled without delay, instructions passed without witnesses. The system demanded someone who could move without drawing attention, someone who could enter and leave without raising alarms, someone already invisible in plain sight. Before we talk about trust, understand how carefully it was calculated. Owners trusted him not because they believed in him, but because they believed in leverage. His family, his position, his survival. Everything about his life was tied to obedience. That dependence made him predictable. Predictability was more valuable than loyalty. Before we talk about access, remember that doors at night were not opened for just anyone. Private rooms, kitchens, storage spaces, places where business happened quietly. This man crossed thresholds that others never could. He carried words that could not be spoken in daylight. He handled matters that required discretion, not witnesses. Before we talk about kindness, we must be clear. There was none. What looked like privilege was actually responsibility wrapped in risk. One mistake could erase him. One misunderstood action could end his role. Freedom of movement did not mean safety. It meant exposure. Before we talk about necessity, understand the unspoken truth. Plantation owners needed someone who could move between spaces without challenging authority. Someone enslaved enough to be controlled, but trusted enough to be sent. He became the solution to a problem the system itself created. Total control made flexibility impossible. He was that flexibility. Before we talk about power, recognize how strange it was. He had none, yet held influence. He could enter homes but owned nothing. He could hear plans but could not speak them. His role existed in silence. That silence protected everyone except him. Before we talk about why owners allowed it, consider the alternative. If they stopped him, things stalled, messages delayed, problems multiplied, the system slowed. His movement kept order intact, so they looked away. They let him pass, not because they trusted his heart, but because they trusted their grip. Before we talk about what this meant for him, remember this. His role was never written clearly. It lived in routine, not records. He existed because the system needed him, and the moment it didn't, he could disappear without a trace. Before we talk about why he moved at night, we need to understand what the night was used for. Darkness was not just absence of light, it was cover, it was privacy. It was the only time certain things could happen without witnesses. That is why his work began when others were ordered to stay still. Before we talk about messages, remember how information traveled in that world. There were no quick signals, no safe public spaces. Words had to be carried by a person. Some messages were too sensitive to be spoken during the day. They involved money, punishment, disputes, or fear. Sending him at night reduced attention, reduced questions, reduced risk for the people in power. Before we talk about emergencies, understand how fragile plantation order really was. Illness struck without warning. Fires spread fast. Enslaved people resisted in quiet ways. Arguments turned dangerous. Owners needed someone who could be summoned instantly, someone who could cross distance without delay. Night did not pause problems. It multiplied them. Before we talk about houses, imagine the scale of these estates. Multiple homes, guest quarters, storage buildings, overseer residences. He moved between them quietly, often in sequence. One door opened led to another. One message led to another task. His route was never random. It followed needs that could not wait until morning. Before we talk about silence, recognize how important it was. Noise attracted attention. Attention created witnesses. Witnesses created records. His job depended on staying unnoticed. Footsteps softened. Voices lowered. Lamps dimmed. He became part of the night itself. Before we talk about secrecy, understand that night work protected reputations. Some matters could not be seen. Some conversations could not be overheard. The darkness allowed plantation owners to manage problems without exposing weakness. He was the instrument that kept those weaknesses hidden. Before we talk about risk, remember that every step carried danger. Patrols still roamed. Dogs still listened. One wrong encounter could end everything. His protection depended on recognition, on knowing faces, on being known just enough. Before we talk about routine, realize that this was not occasional work, it was repeated, normalized, expected. Over time his movement became part of the system. People anticipated his arrival. Doors opened before knocks. Instructions were ready. Before we talk about meaning, understand what this reveals. Night work was not freedom, it was function. It existed because daylight control was too rigid. The system needed a shadow to operate smoothly, and he became that shadow, moving where others were forbidden to go. Before we talk about power, we need to talk about knowledge. In any system, information moves differently than people do. Walls can stop bodies, but they rarely stop words. And this man, by moving freely, walked directly into spaces where words were unguarded. Access did not just give him passage, it gave him awareness. Before we talk about conversations, understand how carelessly people speak when they believe they are safe. At night voices drop, but honesty rises. Plantation owners spoke freely in their own homes. They discussed debts, punishments, fears, and plans. They argued, they confessed, they assumed no one important was listening, but he was there, close enough to hear everything. Before we talk about rooms, imagine spaces rarely seen by the enslaved, offices with ledgers, bedrooms where decisions were whispered, dining rooms after guests had left. These were not public areas, they were private worlds. By entering them he saw how power behaved when it thought it was alone. Before we talk about silence, recognize how much is learned without words. A pause before a sentence, a glance across a table, a door closed too carefully. He noticed what others missed. Patterns formed, meanings connected, information was absorbed without questions asked. Before we talk about danger, understand the weight of knowing too much. He could not react, could not warn, could not reveal what he heard. Knowledge became a burden he carried alone. Every secret stayed trapped behind his expressionless face. Before we talk about difference, realize how separated his awareness was from everyone else's. Other enslaved people knew rules and routines. He knew intentions. They saw punishment. He heard why it was ordered. They saw results. He heard planning. That gap changed how he understood the world. Before we talk about trust, remember that owners rarely realized what they gave away. They believed control meant silence. They forgot that presence creates listening. By letting him enter, they surrendered more than movement. They surrendered privacy. Before we talk about sight, understand that spaces tell stories. The condition of rooms, the placement of objects, the way papers were hidden or left open. He saw urgency, panic, confidence. He saw the system breathing. Before we talk about influence, remember that information does not require authority to exist. It only requires awareness. He may not have spoken, but he knew, and knowing placed him in a position no one planned for. Before we talk about what history records, understand why stories like his feel incomplete. People like him were never supposed to understand the system, yet he did, quietly, fully, and that knowledge lived with him unseen, shaping everything he walked past in the dark. Before we talk about authority, we need to talk about convenience. Power often presents itself as absolute, but in practice it depends on small fragile routines. Plantation owners liked to believe they controlled every movement, yet when this man passed through the night, they did not stop him. Not because they forgot, because stopping him created problems they did not want to face. Before we talk about questions, understand that asking them would slow everything down. Who sent him? Why now? Where he was going? Each question required answers. Each answer required witnesses. Each answer required witnesses. Witnesses created records. Records created risk. Silence was easier, so they let him walk. Before we talk about oversight, recognize how systems protect what works. His movement solved issues before they grew visible. Messages arrived on time. Emergencies were contained. Orders were delivered without confusion. When things function smoothly, power stops examining the process. It only notices when something breaks. Before we talk about interruption, imagine what would happen if he were stopped. A message delayed could mean lost money. An emergency ignored could turn into chaos. A quiet problem could become public. Stopping him did not increase control, it weakened it. Before we talk about routine, remember that repetition creates normality. Night after night he moved. Door after door he entered. Over time, his presence stopped feeling unusual. It became expected. And what is expected is rarely questioned. Before we talk about dependence, understand that control is not just about force, it is about flow, information, labor, response. His movement allowed all of these to continue without friction. Removing him would have required replacing him. That replacement would have required trust, and trust was scarce. Before we talk about fear, recognize that owners also understood what he represented. He knew too much to be disrupted, casually. Interfering with him risked exposure, not rebellion, but revelation. The system relied on secrets remaining buried. Before we talk about authority, notice the contradiction. The people who believed they ruled absolutely depended on someone they technically owned. Their power rested on his obedience, and his obedience rested on their need. Before we talk about discipline, understand why it was rarely applied to him. Punishment draws attention. Attention invites questions. Questions unravel systems. It was safer to look away. Before we talk about control, we must see it clearly. It was not maintained by constant force, but by carefully chosen exceptions. His movement was one of them. The plantation world continued to function at night because he moved through it, unseen, unquestioned, and necessary. Before we talk about fear, we need to understand its direction. Fear did not only flow downward, it moved upward too, quietly, carefully, and without witnesses. Plantation owners held power, but they were not fearless. They knew what they owned, and they knew what they hid. And this man stood uncomfortably close to both. Before we talk about knowledge, remember that he had seen too much, not because he was curious, but because his role placed him there. He heard arguments that revealed weakness. He saw hurried decisions made under pressure. He witnessed moments when control slipped. That kind of knowledge does not disappear just because someone is enslaved. Before we talk about reliance, understand how deeply the system depended on routine. His tasks were woven into daily operations. Messages moved because he moved. Problems stayed contained because he arrived in time. Removing him would not just create silence, it would create disruption. And disruption invited attention. Before we talk about punishment, recognize what it cost. Punishing him publicly would raise questions. Why him? Why now? What went wrong? Others would notice. Overseers would ask. Whispers would spread. Secrets survive only in darkness, not in spectacle. Before we talk about silence, realize how carefully it was maintained. Leaving him alone required restraint. It required pretending not to see him pass, not to ask where he had been, not to comment on what he might have heard. Silence became a shared agreement. Before we talk about fear again, see how specific it was. Owners did not fear rebellion from him. They feared exposure. They feared what might surface. If the wrong action was taken, his punishment could turn him into a problem they could not control. Before we talk about trust, understand that it was never emotional, it was practical. He was reliable because his survival depended on cooperation. They relied on that pressure. At the same time, they feared the consequences of mishandling him. Before we talk about isolation, notice how it protected everyone except him. By keeping distance, owners avoided engagement. They did not confide in him directly. They simply spoke around him, assuming silence. That assumption was risky, but necessary. Before we talk about power, recognize how fragile it becomes when it depends on secrecy. One person knowing too much can destabilize an entire structure. Owners sensed this, even if they never admitted it. Before we talk about why he was left alone, the answer is simple. He was too useful to remove, and too dangerous to confront. So they chose the path of least resistance. They let him pass, they looked away, and in doing so they revealed just how dependent their control truly was. Before we talk about how others saw him, we need to understand how unusual his position was. Among enslaved people, nothing drew attention faster than difference. Everyone lived under the same rules, felt the same weight, feared the same punishments. When someone moved outside those limits, even slightly, it created questions no one could ask out loud. Before we talk about admiration, remember how rare opportunity was. Some watched him pass at night, and felt a quiet sense of awe. He walked when they could not. He crossed boundaries they only whispered about. To them his movement looked like courage, or at least possibility. In a world built to crush hope, even small exceptions felt powerful. Before we talk about fear, understand how danger spreads. Association could be mistaken for involvement. Standing too close, speaking too freely, being seen together, any connection to him could attract attention from overseers, and attention was never safe, so some chose distance, not from dislike, but from survival. Before we talk about suspicion, recognize how carefully trust was measured. Some wondered why he was allowed to move so freely. What had he given up? What had he promised? Was he watched more closely than anyone else? Doubt grew in the absence of answers. Before we talk about silence, notice how little was said. Conversation stopped when he approached. Eyes followed him, then looked away. No one wanted to be overheard. No one wanted to be revered. No one wanted to be remembered. His presence changed behavior, even among those who shared his condition. Before we talk about envy, understand that it did not always come from resentment. Sometimes it came from longing for movement, for air, for the feeling of stepping beyond assigned space. His freedom, limited as it was, highlighted what others lacked. Before we talk about isolation, see how his role separated him. He could not fully belong with those who stayed behind, yet he was never equal to those who let him pass. He existed in the space between, welcomed nowhere completely. Before we talk about two worlds, recognize how exhausting that position was. He heard truths from above, and fears from below. He carried knowledge that could not be shared safely. Speaking could endanger others. Silence could isolate him further. Before we talk about judgment, understand that reactions were shaped by fear, not cruelty. Everyone calculated risk constantly. Admiration and fear lived side by side because survival demanded both. Before we talk about his place among them, remember this: he was neither fully inside nor fully outside. He walked between two worlds, visible to both, protected by neither. In that space, more than chains or freedom, defined his existence. Before we talk about how others saw him, we need to understand how unusual his position was. Among enslaved people, nothing drew attention faster than difference. Everyone lived under the same rules, felt the same weight, feared the same punishments. When someone moved outside those limits, even slightly, it created questions no one could ask out loud. Before we talk about admiration, remember how rare opportunity was. Some watched him pass at night, and felt a quiet sense of awe. He walked when they could not. He crossed boundaries they only whispered about. To them his movement looked like courage, or at least possibility. In a world built to crush hope, even small exceptions felt powerful. Before we talk about fear, understand how danger spreads. Association could be mistaken for involvement. Standing too close, speaking too freely, being seen together. Any connection to him could attract attention from overseers, and attention was never safe, so some chose distance, not from dislike, but from survival. Before we talk about suspicion, recognize how carefully trust was measured. Some wondered why he was allowed to move so freely. What had he given up? What had he promised? Was he watched more closely than anyone else? Doubt grew in the absence of answers. Before we talk about silence, notice how little was said. Conversation stopped when he approached. Eyes followed him, then looked away. No one wanted to be overheard. No one wanted to be revered. No one wanted to be remembered. His presence changed behavior, even among those who shared his condition. Before we talk about envy, understand that it did not always come from resentment. Sometimes it came from longing for movement, for air, for the feeling of stepping beyond assigned space. His freedom, limited as it was, highlighted what others lacked. Before we talk about isolation, see how his role separated him. He could not fully belong with those who stayed behind, yet he was never equal to those who let him pass. He existed in the space between, welcomed nowhere completely. Before we talk about two worlds, recognize how exhausting that position was. He heard truths from above, and fears from below. He carried knowledge that could not be shared safely. Speaking could endanger others. Silence could isolate him further. Before we talk about judgment, understand that reactions were shaped by fear, not cruelty. Everyone calculated risk constantly. Admiration and fear lived side by side because survival demanded both. Before we talk about his place among them, remember this: he was neither fully inside nor fully outside. He walked between two worlds, visible to both, protected by neither. In that space, more than chains or freedom, defined his existence. Before we talk about freedom, we need to be clear about what it really meant in this world. His ability to move at night was not liberty. It was not a choice. It was a carefully measured allowance, granted for convenience and necessity. Every step he took was permitted, not earned. The system watched even when it seemed invisible. What looked like freedom was actually a tool of control. Before we talk about permission, understand that it was conditional. Each night he walked, each house he entered, each task he completed, depended entirely on the invisible rules set by those in power. He could act, but only within strict boundaries. One misstep, one question asked at the wrong time, one failure to obey precisely, could erase him. His freedom was a fragile illusion, held together by the fear and calculation of others. Before we talk about privilege, recognize why it existed at all. It was not given out of kindness or admiration. It existed solely to serve power. Plantation owners allowed him access because it made the system function more smoothly. The moment his role no longer benefited the system, the permission could be revoked. Privilege in this context was a chain in disguise, tied to usefulness rather than respect or humanity. Before we talk about risk, realize how immediate the danger was. Every action carried consequences that could be sudden and severe. He walked knowing that even a small mistake could cost him his life. Awareness was constant. Alertness was mandatory. The night was not a place of safety. It was a place where opportunity and threat existed side by side, inseparable and intertwined. Before we talk about illusion, notice how easily outsiders could misunderstand his position. To those who saw him pass, it appeared he had power, influence, even choice. But that appearance hid the truth. He did not make the rules. He did not hold authority. He existed only within the space allowed to him, constantly reminded of the limits that could not be crossed. Before we talk about responsibility, understand how much he carried silently. Access meant knowledge. Knowledge meant danger. He had to navigate carefully, speak carefully, act carefully. Any lapse, no matter how small, could be fatal. The weight of this freedom was heavy, and it rested entirely on his shoulders. Before we talk about control, recognize how the system reinforced obedience through privilege. By granting movement, the owners created dependency. By creating opportunity, they ensured compliance. He walked, but always under observation. His liberty was conditional, his body still confined by invisible chains that tightened with every misstep. Before we talk about perception, remember that this arrangement was deceptive. To the untrained eye, he was different. To those who understood the rules, he was still enslaved. What looked like independence was actually the most controlled form of service. He existed in a space between fear and necessity, where life and death depended on obedience and discretion. Before we talk about the stakes, know this: in his worlds, nothing was secure. No night could be taken for granted. No permission guaranteed safety. Every step, every movement, every entry was balanced on a knife's edge. Survival depended not on freedom, but on precision. And that is the reality behind the illusion of liberty. What we see in this story is not an isolated case. Across different plantations, similar roles appear again and again. Men who moved freely at night, carrying messages, handling emergencies, and entering spaces others could not, all of them operating under controlled permission. Night access was more common than history books admit, carefully hidden in records or left unspoken. The system depended on these exceptions to function, revealing the quiet truths behind the rigid rules of slavery. If this story gave you a new perspective on history and the hidden mechanics of power, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the past.